Ihantua, Wachbekute, and Wachbetua. The Middle Dakota made up of Ihantua and Ihantuana, and the Western Dakota, Tutua.
The Dakota way, we have what's called Udakuyawaski, which means all our relatives. Everything that God created is a relative of ours.
Many questions about the Dakota culture, Dakota spirituality or religion. In truth, there is no separation. You cannot be a Dakota without them both being together.
The Eastern Dakota were the first of the Ochepi-Shakoan to negotiate with the federal government through treaties. They were also the first to rebel against it. Minnesota's U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 marked the beginning of wars with Ochepi-Shakoan nations that did not end until 1890 at Wounded Knee.
This country still ours spiritually because it was God-given. When God does something, He doesn't take it back.
The land has a memory. Someday someone will be reminded of what happened there, and it probably won't be good.
All right, there were a few giveaways there. Looking ahead to 1862, this video was made in the context of the 150th anniversary of the war in 1862, which we'll get to in a little bit. But before we get to 19th and 20th century history, let's go back in time. The Europeans in the 17th century didn't have satellite imagery. The Dakota certainly didn't, but I wanted to show North America without any boundary lines, because what fundamentally happened over several hundred years was changing the worldview of a land. And even though the Europeans didn't have satellites, they still had this kind of an image of North America when they started coming over in the 1500s, 1600s. They just thought, I see no political lines, therefore it's for the taking. And we can use this as we see fit, and they don't seem to be using it to its full advantage, so game on, if you will. But what the satellite also puts aside is there are lots and lots of people living here for thousands and thousands of years. Oh, sorry, is this video going again? I'm sorry?
Yeah, it's playing 5,000 before Christ.
Let me just close that whole thing up. We don't need that again. Oh, Sheldon Wolfchild talking about the U.S. Dakota War. Sorry, Sheldon. Not yet. And we start over. We'll get there eventually. So, 5,000 before Common Era.
Thank you.
Around, and I suppose, another caveat, I'm going to put a little bit of religious Christian lens through all this because this is who we are. So I could have just done BC, but whatever. Have any of you been to Jeffers Petroglyphs, Southwest Minnesota? A couple. It's an extremely powerful place. Many of these rock carvings were made around the time of Stonehenge. There were people living here for thousands of years, and they told stories in the rock face. They chipped away images, and those images helped them tell stories to each other. So it's well worth a visit to go down there and just experience an extremely spiritual and just powerful place. One of the other things that Jeffers Petroglyph shows us, if you marry talking to native people and their stories, some of the stories they tell amongst themselves today are in this rock face. But if you look at it from an academic standpoint and look at what the styles of the carvings are, you see things that Europeans wouldn't have expected to see, which is there were complex trade routes across the whole continent as several thousand years ago. So some of the carvings down at Jeffers have style that you would expect to see down in the Florida coast or up in the Pacific Northwest, and yet they're here in Minnesota. So there's some evidence that people were traveling back and forth across the country or across the continent, trading with each other, sharing culture, sharing stories, and etc. So lots of complexity, lots more that we don't know about all that than what we do, but That's the baseline for, yes, David?
Well, just to show the effectiveness of those routes, the first explorers, the first white explorers on the northwest coast encountered trade routes that had come from Boston.
There you go.
Lewis and Clark.
Lewis and Clark, we'll get to Lewis and Clark in a minute. Another Dakota word, Omni on the Hahawakpa. This is what we call St. Anthony Falls on the Mississippi River. Gwen Westerman's scholar that lives down in Mankato, so I just thought rather than have yet another European interpretation of things, because there's a lot of that coming up, sorry. The falls right near us on the Mississippi River have been profoundly important to anybody who's lived here as long as the falls have been there. But enter the Europeans now. Father Louis Hennepin, who remembers his order? I forgot to look that up. Franciscan, thank you. He came here in 1680, and he was actually with a Dakota traveling party. It's unclear whether they took him prisoner or whether he hung on for a ride. But he found the falls because the Dakota showed it to him. And then pompously said, I am going to name these falls for my patron saint, St. Anthony of Padua. And then he went back to Europe and wrote travel logs and just trumped up stories of this great North American continent, and the name stuck as people started moving in. This is one of many problematic paintings. Laura can tell you way more about it than I can. This painting hangs in the Capitol. I've actually brushed out some of the bad bits of it, but it's a romanticized view of what happened when Father Hennepin came to the falls. At Mill City Museum, there's a movie, and I thought appropriately, they interpreted the Dakota people not looking up at him in adoration, but actually with boredom. Like, what are you doing, guy? And if you look at this guy.
Yeah, the guy in the
he wasn't
canoe.
intended to be looking bored, but he sure does. And I kind of like that interpretation better. So anyway, Father Hennepin, whom Hennepin County is named for, and a bunch of other things, put his mark on this place with that naming convention. 1680, that was the fur trade era, was going in full swing. The Ojibwe and Anishinaabe were moving in from the east, and that's a whole other story. But the fur trade was a rich and complex era of this time. Started with, I'm sorry? The beavers. It was all about the beavers making hats for the fashions in Europe. It started with the French. As the British took over the continent, they took over the fur trade, and then as the Americans took over, they were muscling in as well. The key thing about the fur trade was it was low impact, high impact on terms of like trade goods and money being exchanged and all that sort of thing. Low impact in terms of the number of humans. The fur trade started by the French was all about leveraging relationships. They came to quickly realize if you want to do business with native people, you've got to enter their kinship status. So the idealized painting on the right, many daughters of chiefs were married to European fur traders so that the Europeans could get into that clan, that tribe, and start trading with them. And Margie's saying, yep, I know a little bit about that story. This just went on and on for several hundred years until we ran out of beavers. There are still beavers around, and I found out last week there's a grad student that wants to bring beavers back to Bassett Creek up by Worth Park, so that's kind of interesting. That would be cool. That would be cool. So, potentially boring map with a lot of complexity, but this just shows the extent of the fur trade, again, originally with the French and then the British moving in, but also gives you a sense on the right of how many different tribes were populating this continent. And it's not that they didn't have areas of influence and whatever, and it's not that they didn't have conflict, it's just that they didn't have hard lines. They had shifting alliances and conflicts and shifting lines, but in general, that's where they were hanging around. So, get to the 19th century. You mentioned Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark, of course, went on their voyage at Jefferson's behest because of the Louisiana Purchase, because the Americans said, hey, French, you seem to own this land. and we'll buy it from you. So everybody knows about Lewis and Clark. They got sent out west to see the extent of that purchase. Zebulon Pike, a little bit more quietly, at least in the national psyche, went north up the Mississippi and ended up at Bedote that Laura was talking about, which is where the two rivers meet, the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. Pike boldly formed a treaty with a couple Dakota people. He had no authority to do this, but he did it anyway. The Senate never ratified it, but this was the first foothold of federal government in the United States in a tiny little, I don't have the map here, it'll come up in a couple things, a tiny little corner of what's now Minnesota, saying this is now federal land. The really cruel irony of all this is Bedote, also known as Mendota, if you know the town of Mendota, that is one of the most sacred Dakota places. It's an origin story for many Dakota people. That was the first place that the federal government took, and that became a really focal point place for genocide 100 years later, or 60 years later, sorry. So the tragedies compound in this spot on land. Up on the far right, so 1805, the treaty was signed. 1819, Fort Snelling was begun. And you can see a view, this is an 1840s view, if memory serves, of this is what's now Pike Island, named for that guy. There's Fort Snelling. This is Mendota in the foreground. That's Henry Sibley's fur trading thing. And you've got some Dakota teepees up here. So that's the Bedote area. Tiny, but it gets bigger, and et cetera.
Well, that spot on, what is it now, as you drive across Waukesha, above the...
That's not Pilot Knob. Pilot
Knob
Knob is,
Pilot Knob, but, what,
I don't know what it's called.
but that was also in with migration, or the seven nations would meet up there, or...
Yeah, I don't know that story, but
That same...
that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, Pilot Knob that Laura mentioned is right up here to the left from this photo, across the river from these two places. Lawrence Tolliver, not Taliaferro, but he's a Virginian and pronounced it Tolliver for some reason. He was a key figure for government policy in this period, 1819 when the fort was started to 1839 when the treaties started to come in. He was the Indian agent for the federal government. And the U.S. government's design and purpose in this area, in this time period, was keep the settlers out. We've got enough area to the east for settlers to do. What we need to do is manage the fur trade and keep the British at bay, because we've now won the War of 1812. The British are off the continent, and we want to keep them off the continent, but they still have fur traders mucking about. So Fort Snelling was built as a fortress to hopefully keep Dakota and Ojibwe people working together for the purposes of the fur trade. And Lawrence Tolliver was a key person to make all that happen. He was the civilian arm of the military side of that whole endeavor. A little side note with Lawrence Tolliver, are a number of you aware of Dred Scott? And okay, many of you are aware, that's great. So Lawrence Tolliver, being a Virginian, being here with kind of semi-military, yes, he had slaves. One of his slaves was Harriet Robinson, who married Dred Scott. So it was Dred and Harriet Scott who sued for their freedom when they were taken back down to Missouri, that set off the tinderbox that started the Civil War. In his gentlemanly, paternalistic sort of way, he gave Harriet to Dr. Emerson as a wedding present for Dred and Harriet. It's like, you two should be together, so, you know. Lawrence Tolliver these are all complicated guys. He did a lot of good things, but he did it through his particular lens, so nothing simple about it. I told you we'd talk about Christianity. So the missionaries throughout all this period, Gideon and Samuel Pond came on the scene. They were Congregationalists that became Presbyterians. Thomas Williamson, I didn't see a reference to his denomination.
Presbyterian.
Thank you.
That's my uncle's great-grandfather.
Oh, so once again, if you get interested in the Williamsons, Laura can spend a whole 45 minutes.
So is Gideon Pond. He has a double great-grandparents up there.
Stephen and Mary Riggs, they moved out west, and the Riggs are responsible for a profoundly important thing, is they helped create the first Dakota English dictionary. So Dakota language is really in peril. There are very fewer and fewer native speakers, but a lot of what we know about it was thanks to the Riggs working with the Dakota people.
Say that again, the Dakota English language
Dakota English dictionary.
dictionary.
Yeah, so that we can connect the words back and forth to each other. But of course, they all had an agenda, right? Their agenda is to, as it was often said, take the Indian out of the man to save the man. So we must Christianize these people. We must make them more like us if they're going to survive, because clearly the United States is expanding and becoming what it wants to be, and they need to get with the program. And so the missionaries were part of that effort. Yes?
Yeah, Weber, who taught at Augustana, talked about the fact that the missionaries that spent time living with the Native Americans before talking about how the gospel, they were the first ones that got fired. But they wanted to understand, you know, what the issues were within that community. Because they talked about Jesus.
Yeah. Dave, yes?
Another thing that doesn't seem to be mentioned in that group of missionaries at least is that overall, the missionaries who were most successful in influencing Native Americans were Roman Catholic missionaries. Because they didn't try to turn them into white Protestants.
And I'm not familiar with Catholic missionaries in Minnesota, but there probably were some.
Well, there were some. Father DeSmet would be one, but he moved on farther west.
Yeah, they weren't the most influential ones for whatever reason. I left Henry Whipple for last just because there's another little foreshadowing here. Bishop Whipple, for whom a building is now named, he's probably the most famous of these guys at this point. He famously went to Washington to meet with Lincoln in 1862 at the end of the U.S.-Dakota War to plead the case for mercy on some of these Dakota warriors. So Abraham Lincoln, I think people forget how much of a politician Lincoln was and how good of a politician he was before he was elder statesman. So this feels a little flip, but you know, Lincoln had a sense of humor. So Whipple came here the other day and talked with me about the rascality of this Indian business until I felt it down to my boots. And we'll get to Lincoln and the stuff at some point. We'll just talk about it now. So at the end of the U.S.-Dakota War, 303 Dakota men were sentenced to death. And Whipple went to Washington and to Lincoln and said, this was a kangaroo court. It was a tribunal that had no due process. This is terrible. And Lincoln was the one who took it down to 38, the famous 38 that were hanged in Mankato. Many people like to say, wow, Lincoln, you saved so many lives. That's great. Many Dakota people are like, Lincoln, you signed the death warrant, so we're holding you accountable for that. There's no easy or clear path in any of this stuff once it got bad.
So John, when
Yes.
you're talking about that hanging, when I worked at Pete St. Paul's in Mankato, we looked at baptismal records the day before the hangings, and there's a lot of native people being baptized.
Wow, so they did a fast baptism.
The Jesuits were trying to do as best they could.
Wow, again, the Catholics. I did not know that story.
Well, Thomas Williamson walked every day from St. Peter to Mankato in November and December of 1862, and a lot of baptisms that occurred were of Presbyterian nature. That he was also a physician, so he treated their illnesses as well, but he also was responsible for a lot of those baptisms.
I guess that's not faith forming faith.
All right, so I've made a few references to 1862, which is clearly a pivotal moment in our collective history, white and Dakota together. And it's all about the settlement era. The fur trade was on the way out. They'd extracted the resources they could extract with financial advantage, and it was time to let the settlers in. This is a idealized painting, also in the capital, of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. The reason this is an important, an instructive painting, if you're here to interpret it, is there's the infamous Barrel Treaty right here. So through the fur trade era, the European traders were doing European methods of debt and paying off debt and back and forth. And the Indians were like, well, that's a curious concept, but all right, we'll go along with this. By the time Traverse des Sioux Treaty came about in 1851, the traders had all sorts of ledgers of Indians who owed them debt. And the traders' papers on that barrel to the left were after they signed the official treaty saying, we will give you this land, which has all sorts of cultural implications about who meant what. They signed a paper saying, and when the federal government pays us for this land, they pay the traders' debts first. But nobody explained this when that treaty was being signed. They just thought they were signing a second copy of the treaty. But this was one of the many reasons that it became a powder keg for the next 10 years. So, treaties carving up what's now Minnesota, creating what's now Minnesota. We had treaties in 1837, 51, and 58 that are opening up all these lands. And this starts to get instructive for where we're standing today. The 1837 treaty said you have to stay as a white settler on the east bank of the Mississippi River. We'll talk about that some more in a second. But this was all leading up to Minnesota Territory was 1849, so the 37 treaty made Minnesota Territory possible. 49 then spurred the Traverse des Sioux and Washington treaties. And you think there might have been a power imbalance when you're negotiating a treaty in Washington, D.C. with Dakota people? Yeah, I think there might have been. And then 1858 for statehood was finishing the deal, or actually renegotiating the deal about the reservations on the north side of the Minnesota River. So, why do treaties matter? The 1837 treaty said, white settlers, you have to stay on the east bank of the Mississippi River. So where we're standing today is on the west bank of the river, and it's the red little dot right there. You can't see it because it wasn't gridded out. But this was Fort Snelling military reservation land. So Fort Snelling had shifted now from enforcing and making the fur trade work better for Americans to continuing to manage land and manage what's now turning into the settlement era. And then as settlement started, by the time you get to 1852, they're shrinking down the reservation in that shaded area because they're opening up places like where we are now to settlement. So a couple of glimpses of the future for any map geeks. You can see, even in 1839, some lines in the landscape of what's now Hennepin Avenue, what's now Hiawatha Avenue. These are long traveled routes, and Hiawatha in particular makes a lot of sense because Hiawatha Avenue is basically a big portage from St. Anthony Falls down to Fort Snelling. The gorge between those two places was a rapids for most of its existence, so you couldn't easily take boats up and down through the gorge, so people would portage all along what's now Hiawatha. And I don't know if you can see in the back, this is Powderhorn Lake. That's how I know where Mount Olive is, because that's a reference point. So, 1855, treaties are signed. They're being ignored. They're not being fulfilled very well. But the gritting begins, and so you can start to see the beginnings of Minneapolis. And again, just a profoundly different way of thinking about land. Land is no longer a collective. As it said in that video, we are the land is us. It's part of their ethos. No, now it's individual properties, and we're going to put it into boxes, and we're going to sell these properties. Little side note, because that's fun every once in a while. Have any of you wondered why there's a jog in Chicago and all these other South Minneapolis streets? Because Minneapolis is originally a river town, and the grid followed the river until they realized they're moving south, and Germans and Scandinavians and their orderly minds said, come on, we can't be doing the whole thing off the compass points. So after this, they shifted all the streets to make them pure north-south. And we're on that new grid as it was being created. So this little bit of illustration, sorry, data geekery of the profound change to this land, not just gridding it out, but tons more people. So I talked about the fur trade impact in very high terms. 1850, there were 6,000 people. I don't think that was a very accurate count, but who knows? It's thought that 84% of the people in 1850 were indigenous. 1860, it had jumped 10 years later, 172,000 people. 1870, it had quadrupled again, 439,000 people in Minnesota. This is mirrored in Minneapolis. They didn't even have a census in Minneapolis before 1870 because it was founded in 67. We had 13,000, jumping to 46, jumping to 164. And then I thought, this is a German congregation, let me throw in a little German in here because that's also part of the tragedy of 1862, I think. Not coincidentally, in that 1851 to 60 treaty period, a whole pile of Germans came over from Europe and started settling here, lots of them in the Minnesota River Valley. And then another bump, and I circled that one because I'm conjecturing here, I didn't do the hard math, but I'm guessing that 1881 to 90 bump are this congregation's forebears. This is an English church, but these are probably their parents and grandparents coming over, speaking German. Huge influx, needing more churches, needing more everything. So, 1862. It's like 5 lectures to talk about this very complicated 6 weeks in 1862. The aftermath is just profoundly tragic, but profoundly important to what happened in the state. We talked about the hanging in Dakota. This is the 38 who were hanged in Mankato, sorry. These are some of the settler refugees that came out in 1862. This was a depiction in one of the magazines of, there were Dakota captives that were taken back up the river valley to that concentration camp in the lower right at Fort Snelling. And the soldiers alternatively had to, there's lots of conflicting accounts about this, but this is a depiction of what was documented several times. Angry settlers who had survived the 6-week war beating on Dakota people, doing terrible atrocities because they were really angry about what had just happened. So one of the things, the reason I brought up the German piece was, for better or worse, a little bit of both, in that fur trade era, relationship building, you could only be successful in the fur trade if you built a relationship of some kind, even if it was imbalanced with power, even if it was imperfect. But these German settlers, who were thrown in with talk of land of milk and honey, were thrown into the Minnesota River Valley as, this is a wide open place for you to settle and make a farm and make a new life for yourself. They did not know what they were walking into, and they did not speak Dakota. They didn't know Dakota people. They wondered why they're still here. They're fearful. And so in 1862, when some Dakota men said, we've had enough, and they took up arms, these settlers were caught in the crossfire. And yeah.
On top of that, those German immigrants were refugees in their own way.
Exactly.
Because the thing that caused a big influx at that time was the failure of revolutions in 1848. And the authoritarian government just really clamped down.
Yeah.
Which led a lot of people down.
You could argue, anybody who says globalization, this is a really big new thing in the 21st century. No. Globalization has been going along for a long time, in my opinion. So, lots of bad stuff. This is Shakopee and Medicine Bottle, who were rounded up in Canada and brought back to Fort Snelling and hanged in 1863, I believe. It just went bad for a while. So I'm going to pick on these two because they need to be picked on a little bit. Henry Sibley up at the top. In my mind, Sibley's a more complicated, interesting character than Ramsey. He led the expedition to fight the U.S.-Dakota War. He obviously was really pissed off. He says, my heart is steeled against them, and if I have the means, I'll sweep them to the besom of death, the broom of death. But he was a fur trader originally. He came in here as a fur trader and then became a politician. All of these fur traders saw that the game was changing in the 1850s, and the successful ones flipped and said, all right, new rules. He became a politician. He became the state's first governor. Ramsey was the first territorial governor in 1849. Ramsey came in that second era of relationship. What are you talking about? So whereas Dakota had, Sibley had a Dakota wife and they had a child, and then as the tides were turning, he lost his Dakota wife and married a respectable white woman. Ramsey was just kind of pure settler Yankee. We're going to make this country an organized place. Thank you very much. So Ramsey was like, our course is now plain. 6 weeks after the war started in August, the Sioux Indians, another name for the Dakota that the Europeans put on them, must be exterminated or driven forever from the borders of this land. And that's a quote that lives in infamy to this day.
He was
Yeah.
offering bounties on scallops as well.
Oh, yeah.
He said a lot of words.
And he was an equal opportunity bad guy. He did some bad stuff up at Sandy Lake with the Ojibwe. He was making the Minnesota that we know and love today. So his complicated legacy, in my opinion, is he did a lot of bad stuff, but if you appreciate any part of Minnesota and what we are, he was also that legacy. I mean, he organized the state as the first powerful politician. Yes?
As governor, Alexander Ramsey did at least one constructive thing in Indian relationships.
What was that?
That was the Mille Lacs band of the Ojibwa found their wild rice beds being flooded because a lumber company had built an illegal dam on the Rum River. Incidentally, just to show the difference between Indian and white mentalities on the frontier, the Indians called that the Spirit River.
Yeah, the Europeans turned into the Rum River, indeed.
But what happened was they built this dam, were flooding the wild rice beds, thereby destroying the wild rice crop, which the Indians relied on for food. So the Indians went and tore the dam down. After appealing to the government for redress and getting nothing, they tore the dam down. The lumber companies went storming to the governor and said, "Send in troops and destroy these vicious Indians." Ramsey refused to do so.
Was he still governor at that time, or was
He pointed out that their dam was illegal and they had no right to redress.
Yeah. At the risk of being overly cynical, I'm sure that he had some other financial reasons to do that too. Because he wasn't doing anything out of the kindness of his heart for Indians. I'm confident of that. This is too hard for all of you to read, but I can share this around and I'll bring bibliography next week if people want it. But this shows the Dakota diaspora after 1862. Tragically, the people that were brought to Fort Snelling were then put on a boat. They had to take Mississippi all the way down to St. Louis and then the Missouri back up to live in horrible conditions in Nebraska and South Dakota. Sorry, we're good Minnesota. If you've been to Northwest Nebraska, it's not a pleasant place. They're just abject poverty and what have you. But a lot of this diaspora too was of their own agency. A lot of Dakota who were involved in the war fled up to Canada, and their descendants live there to this day. I talked about the risk to Dakota language. One of the best pockets of native-speaking Dakota is actually in Canada because of that diaspora. So just a couple mop-up things on 1862. February of 63, Congress annulled the treaties. They weren't honoring them. Big reason for 1862 was they weren't making the payments were late. They were, you could argue, written in bad faith. But now the treaties are abrogated and annulled. In March, they passed a second bill officially removing Dakota from their ancestral homeland, saying it is now illegal for these Dakota people to be in Minnesota. That law is still on the books, and it's been going through Minnesota legislature. I saw this week on South Dakota as well, to pass a thing of support saying to Congress, can you please take this one off the books? That has not passed yet. It would be a ceremonial, like a symbolic thing for Minnesota to do that. A little bit of another jumping ahead or foreshadowing. There are 4 federally recognized Dakota tribes today. There's a 5th that's unrecognized by the federal government, another long story. But in the 1880s and 90s, the government started buying back land and putting the friendly Dakotas onto that land. There were Dakota people that never left. And there were Dakota people that worked with the government during the war, tried to stay out of it. Many of them were under Sibley's protection. There's a whole complicated story and relationship there. Again, Sibley had relationships. That set the stage. So, we're almost out of time. This is a lot faster, it's a lot easier, but people said, so, Mount Olive, its place on this land. I showed you that little red square earlier. This is 1885, so 20 years after 1862, give or take. Here's 31st in Chicago. You'll see 31st didn't go through. I haven't done the research, maybe one of you has, but there's a story here of that stupid jog that drives us crazy. And I don't know who screwed up or who had what intention. We probably don't have time to delve into it today, but that's, like, this shows the street didn't go through in 1885, which somebody didn't match them up. By 1892, 7 years later, now 31st is going through, you've got your jog, and Erastus Byers owns this whole plot. You can see buildings are in yellow, so there's no building here. These are just lots for speculative sale. By 1903, where are we? Here's 31st. Still speculative, nobody on our plot of land, but some neighbors are starting to show up. And then by 1914, Mount Olive has arrived. Here we are. And maybe some of you know this history already. I've only seen this photo, this building as a photo, so I never knew what was going on in the back of the building. There's no picture in the back. You can see on this map, if that's the narthex, that's the sacristy, I would guess. There's a jut out on the back of the building as well. I don't know if in our records Michael Lansing would know if we've got plans of that original church building. But 1909, this congregation moved into the neighborhood, put up that structure, and then in help me folks, what year was this building built?
30. 25, finished with 31.
31, thank you. So by the time the next plat map that I found was 38, and you can see the familiar outline of where we're standing today. And I found a couple pictures of good people in Mount Olive in the Hennepin County archives, so thought you might be interested to see what was going on in 1938 and 1939. We were celebrating our 30th anniversary of the church with a tea service, and the Ladies' Aid was doing a benefit for the Children's Friends Society, and we're building the place that we know today. Okay, that was a lot. 45 minutes, sorry, but David?
The funny dogs in the streets are quite common around Minneapolis. They're also very common in rural areas on roads that have been laid out along section lines. And usually the way that happens is that two surveyors start at different places and head toward each other. And the point where they meet is where they don't quite match up. But the primary problem behind it, and the reason you'll find it in rural areas too, is that they're trying to lay out a rectangular grid on a spherical surface.
Yeah.
And
it doesn't work.
You have to make corrections at certain points
right.
for that to work.
Other questions, comments? Where do you want to go from here? I didn't put together bibliographies or handouts, but if people are interested, I can do that for next week.
I would strongly recommend looking at your own family migration patterns within the United States, because for me anyway, it's revealed a lot about where I've settled, the benefit that I have from all my ancestors, where they've settled on land that was, taken away. It's like, it's pretty eye-opening. It was a lot more than I realized.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were able actually to trace almost to the dollar amount the wealth that is ours, because my great-grandparents settled in McLeod County in 1875 on land that was acquired in the Travis de Sioux Treaty. And based on, land records and sales and all of that, the amount of money that passed through the family and ultimately came down to us and to our daughters, and now to our granddaughters. It is eye-opening. If you have any roots in the land anywhere in this country, there's a possibility that your family has accumulated some wealth based on
And
that
if you
land.
don't, I love Claudia Wilkinson's quote. She's a black woman, and she tries to help white people who are struggling with, but I wasn't here, am I complicit in this? She said, you buy a house, if your house has a wet basement, you now own that wet basement, and you're gonna have to figure out how to fix that up. You're gonna have to clean it up. And so any of us who own property on Dakota homeland have bought that house. We've bought into, we're part of the legacy now, whether we like it or not. And how we think about that, how we deal with it, we all get to figure that out. But
John, can you talk a little bit about the doctrine of discovery and how that impacted? Or maybe you don't want to do that, that's okay.
Laura, why don't you talk about the doctrine of discovery and how that impacted? Are you talking like manifest destiny?
The doctrine of discovery came about, this was the Pope, basically the Catholic Church, decided that if land was empty, it was, for Christians, if it was empty land, it could be settled. And so that was when you talked about, the English settlers, or the English colonizers, or the pilgrims coming over here and seeing that this was empty land.
Yeah.
That was part of what their ethos was. This is empty land, so it's ours, and you mentioned that.
Yeah.
But part of that was driven by the doctrine of discovery, and the doctrine of discovery kept, snowballing across this entire continent. And the Lutheran Church, there have been attempts by Christian organizations to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, and because of
Yeah,
many.
so I threw it back to you because I didn't know that doctrine, but
Yeah.
it resonates in my family. I got the history book from my uncle, and I remember him telling me as a child, yeah, we weren't on Dakota land. Because there were no villages that were documented. There was a village at Lake Chetek, but that's not our little corner. And so it was that mindset. He was a progressive, really smart guy in all sorts of ways, but he had that mindset of not exactly here. Yeah.
Yeah, some of that is the definition of empty.
Right.
What to Europeans, if there weren't, settlements and lines on a map, and fortifications and whatever, that meant it was free for the taking. But according to the Dakota, it was all held in common. It was not empty. There was a basic disconnect in terminology and concept. But the other thing I was going to say is part of the reason, and I think a lot of us know this, is part of the reason that the land appeared empty to Europeans is that the European diseases had already swept ahead of the settlers and killed, estimates are into the millions of Native Americans. This country was pretty well populated before European diseases.
Yeah, I should have pulled that population fact out, but you're right. It was
You can kind of tell from the trade routes, that took people.
Yes, it did.
Took a lot of people to maintain and use those trade routes regularly and carve them out. So you can kind of get a sense that there were a lot of people here, but they had no exposure, no immunity to European diseases. It just wiped them out.
Yep.
The estimates are that in Plymouth, when the English arrived in Plymouth in 1620, the native population had been decimated by 90%.
Oh, yeah.
90% had been wiped out by disease in the couple of decades prior to the English arriving here.
Following up on your comments, I think that there's, of the many things that we can take away from today, I'd say there's a caution in the generally white European view that something is only useful as long as it can make us money. And that pertains not only to our relationship with our native brothers and sisters, but also in terms of our impact on climate change and whatnot. If we see a piece of land that is empty, that is not useless, that is home to animals and birds and wildlife and whatnot, it's useful for those animals to eat, it's useful for us to eat, but so often the attitude is, I can't make money off of that, therefore it's useless.
Yeah, and I spoke pretty flippantly about the beavers went away.
Right. Wonder why.
The beaver population crashed because it was overkilled, and so that system of nomadic moving around and sustainably extracting resources was completely blown up because more money.
Well, in my own genealogy, it's like the obituaries for my ancestors were all about how they contributed to like clearing the land, they were cutting down all the timber, they were digging up all the native, grasses and all that thing. So it's like that was what was present in a lot of the minds of people, is like how great that was, that we did all these great things to clear the land and in the name of progress, and it's obviously it's benefited us all.
And it still does. I mean,
it still does. Yes.
There were good things done with some of that lumber. There's a lot of waste to it, but
and we're coming back to full circle, and we're trying to repair the land and all that.
Right.
One of the unfortunate things about from the ELC is that the ALC disappeared. ALC was doing a lot of creative things for the Native Americans. And one of the things they did was bring in Elmer Running, who was a Native Dakota medicine man. He was also Christian. He would do, and we paid him to come into the Phillips neighborhood and do healing ceremonies among Native people that live in the Phillips neighborhood. And we went to about 5 of them, including my son. And there were amazing healings going on that I won't go into detail, but they understood. I think they were part of what we call the cosmic Christ, the universal Christ. I mean, they understood how God was expressing himself within nature. And we didn't listen to that. We really shouldn't listen to that. If they could have told us, they could have helped our theology.
Yeah.
So, slightly off topic, but a little sort of just a thought. When I lived in Washington, I lived really close to the Canadian border, spent a lot of time up in Vancouver especially. And one of the things that occurred to me, which I think is sort of important in thinking in the way we think about this, even though we've sort of evolved a little bit from calling them Indians, to now Native Americans, in some ways, we are still giving a huge number of people a name that we created, of land that wasn't ours, right? And one of the things that I love about the way the Canadians have really started to think about this is that they refer to the Native people as First Nations people. And the reason why is if you look at those maps, those were their nations, and we took their nations from them.
Yep.
They were the First Nations. And I love that, and I try to use that language because it reminds me that we created this nation by taking theirs.
Yeah. And language is complicated. I think we can talk a little bit about that next week if people are interested. What I try to do always is be as specific as possible, because maybe some of you bridled about being lumped in with Europeans. Like, I've got this heritage. So better to say Dakota, Ojibwe, Shawnee, whatever. But you have to have some shortcuts sometimes. And it's complicated because humans, the people are still here, and many of them say, I'm an Indian. Like, Native American, fine, I'm an Indian. Because that's their identity, and their identity is complicated by this complicated history. So it's just an ongoing negotiation and figuring out.
Well, and I guess my point is not to say that others should think about this way. I'm just saying that for me, that's the way that I was able to change my mindset.
Yeah.
In my language is to think about the fact that
Yeah.
this nation that we think of as America, well, our ancestors gave it that name.
That's right.
Right? And they took the many nations away from people whose nations.
And that's a
And
helpful way to
so to me,
think
that
about
was
it.
like a shift in language that helped me always keep that.
Yep. And that's important. It's like, how do you get your mind around it?
Yeah.
When the Indian Child Welfare Act came through Congress, somebody at the state decided to had representatives of the various native nations together to ask them, how do we call you? What do you want to be called in our legislation? And the unanimous opinion in that group was that they wanted to be called American Indian. They didn't want to be called Native Americans or anything like First Nations, that their choice was for American Indian. And so you'll see that in the statutes for child welfare especially.
And yeah, I think a common thread on this, I've talked about relationships. I firmly believe you start with getting into a relationship with someone and then say, what do you like to be called? Some people are going to say, call me an Indian. Some people are going to say, call me Indigenous, call me First Nations. Get to know people. I mean, that's some of the basics. So, I think we're officially out of time.
Thank you.
John, so much. You're welcome.